Okay, Martin.
Hello, a very good morning and welcome to all of you in person here in Yerevan. Very good to see you all. And to those of you joining us online, of course. My name is Jonathan Charles. I'm chair of the EBRD Alumni Association and I'm also a strategic advisor. Today, we are looking at the latest economic forecasts across the EBRD regions. We also have our sign language interpretation as well today. And what are we looking at? Well, inflation, monetary policy, geopolitical tensions, and the fragmentation of trade continue to pose risks for growth. However, the global economy has shown resilience, narrowly avoiding the stagflation which we talked about this time last year when we were in Samarkand, if you saw us there. But the question remains, is it possible to tame inflation amidst all the geopolitical tensions that we are suffering? So, what is the picture in the EBRD regions and beyond? Here to help us launch our latest regional economic prospects are our economic heavyweights. Beata Javorcik is EBRD Chief Economist and Professor of Economics at the University of Oxford. Harold James is Professor of History and International Affairs at Princeton. Heike Harmgart is the Managing Director for the EBRD SEMED region, the Southern and Eastern Mediterranean. And joining us remotely online, Martin Wolf, Chief Economics Commentator for the Financial Times, who got up very early in London today. Whether you are watching us here in the audience on X, LinkedIn or YouTube, please feel free to post your questions in the comment boxes on Slido. That is slido.com is where you'll find that. There is a slide here. There's also a QR code you can use. The hashtag you'll need is 668-37795. Post your questions in there and we'll come to them towards the end of this session in about 40 minutes or so. Right, let us move on. Let's start with the overview of economic growth across the EBRD regions. How are the EBRD economies doing? Beata, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good morning, everyone. After a difficult 2023, when growth in the EBRD regions was below expectations and below the global average, things are looking up. The economic activity will pick up this year and even more so next year. But of course, all these forecasts are subject to huge uncertainty. The war in Ukraine is casting a long shadow over Europe. There is a fallout from the war in Gaza that is being felt in southeastern Mediterranean. And geopolitical tensions do not augur well for the future. Only yesterday, the Biden administration announced a new round of tariffs on China. So expect more tensions soon.
Beata, thank you very much indeed. Okay, so let's take a bit of a closer look at the EBRD regions. And when we do that, where are the winners, where are the losers? How does it pan out? Yeah.
Well, it's worth mentioning Central Europe and the Baltics. Last year, that region essentially saw zero growth. Countries like Estonia saw their economies shrinking by almost 3%. This year, things are better. There will be a 3% growth in Poland and in Croatia. But of course, prices of natural gas in Europe are 4 times as high as in the US. And the weakness in Germany will grow by 0.2% this year. So essentially, very little increase in economic activity. That weakness of Germany means lower export demand for our regions of operations, particularly for Central Europe. Now, on the positive side, Central Asia will be the fastest growing region among our regions of operations. If you remember, in 2022, it received influx of capital from Russia. Many businesses from there moved to the region, as well as many people, including some very highly skilled professionals. IT businesses are quite notable in that respect. And this influx is still paying dividends. Also, intermediated trade, even though it reached a plateau, it continues fuel economic activity. And of course, strong demand for commodities.
All right, thank you very much, Beata. Heike, let me turn to you as we drill deeper into the EBRD regions. What about the southern and eastern Mediterranean, your area?
The southern and eastern Mediterranean region, unfortunately, is not one of the fastest growing. And actually, Beata's team had to revise the forecast down for this year and next because multiple shocks, the long shadow that we've just heard about from the war in Ukraine in terms of commodity prices, wheat. I mean, this region is the largest wheat importer, plus, of course, the pressure on energy prices, but also, of course, some regional shocks, the impact of the war on Gaza. We cannot even yet fully understand the extent of which it will have an impact on these key drivers of the economy, such as tourism, but also Suez economic canal revenues that are down 50% just since the beginning of the year, which are a lifeline also, of course, and a key contributor for FX for a country such as Egypt, which also in and of itself plays an important role for the region. So muted growth prospects, and I think we will later also talk about the challenges around the inflation, coupled with a little bit of some of the domestic challenges of some of the countries in the Eastern Mediterranean region. More stability and economic structural reform momentum in Morocco. Egypt, a bit of a more bumpy ride, but big macroeconomic improvements with the IMF program, the liberalization of the exchange rate. Still domestic struggles in Lebanon that really prevent growth moving forward. And Jordan, of course, also depending on tourism and the stability of the region, which is difficult. And then, of course, we are also looking at the West Bank and Gaza, which has the most direct impact of the war, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank economy, where over 20% of GDP depends on workers working in Israel, and the disruptions there are really important contributors to the recession there. Tunisia, it's a bit of a mixed picture. We do see some growth prospects, and the latest bigger packages from the EU have really helped stabilize some of the challenges on the fiscal side. But of course, growth is also still subdued, mainly there on the back of a very, very poor agricultural performance this year. So a mixed picture, a challenging picture. We have the global challenges, some specific regional challenges, and on top of it, some sort of domestic political challenges on the structural reform side. So never dull in the southern and eastern Mediterranean region, but also a lot of challenges in particular this year.
Yeah, mixed picture sounds a very polite way of putting it, actually. Okay, so inflation's obviously been a challenge in the global economy for some time. Maybe we should have a look at that. Martin Wolf in London, what is happening in that respect in terms of the United States, the Eurozone, the big economic drivers?
Well, first of all, just a small correction. I'm actually in Italy, which made an hour less brutal than it would otherwise be. I apologize for not being with you. I think the broad story here, just one sort of opening remark, it's very, very important to realize that the US economy has performed despite similarities in inflation, I think in large part accidental, to do with the energy price shock being so huge for Europe. But the US economy has really been going gangbusters in the last few years. Between 2019 and 24, real GDP per head in the US rose by more than 8%, according to IMF forecasts for this year, while the only larger European economy to get close to this, interestingly, is Italy, which managed 6%. And the other big European countries are close to zero, and that includes the UK, or even negative. So they're completely different GDP performance. And in the US, that has gone with very strong demand, strong employment, very low unemployment. And yet, interestingly, inflation figures have ended up looking a little similar. And I think that's in significant measure accidental. And that's very important in understanding the divergence. In the US, it looked 6 months ago as though they really were going to achieve immaculate disinflation. Inflation was going to fall to target. Interest rates were widely expected to be lowered significantly by the Fed this year, really back towards normal. Now that looks considerably less likely. The Fed is much more cautious, and I think it's probable that we're not going to see more than one or at the most two cuts this year, and interest rates in the US will remain high. It's of course still possible that all this monetary tightening will suddenly have a really big effect on the US economy, but we're not seeing it yet, just signs of it. Europe is, I think, really different. The big shocks have passed. The domestic demand growth has been weak. Many people feel the ECB was too cautious, and we expect cuts to start in the ECB by the ECB next month. And I would expect rates to fall significantly in the course of this year. Some divergence between the US and Europe on monetary policy, all assuming, of course, no more really big shocks. So we are getting out of the big inflation period, but it looks as though it's going to be really quite tricky, particularly in the US, and of course that has very great significance for the world economy.
Just very quickly, Martin, do you think there is a new normal in inflation? I mean, when I asked that question, I mean, we talked about 2% in the past. That was always the aim. Do you think there's a new normal above 2%?
Well, my view is there are lots of people who somehow think that sort of, if I may put it this way, God decrees a sort of rate of inflation that we have to have. Very similar arguments were made in the 70s. I remember them well, the advantage or disadvantage of age. It's a question, in my view, of what the central banks choose and whether they take their mandate seriously. What may be true is to get back to 2% will require longer and more painful, tight monetary policy than many hoped, say, 6 months or so ago. And the question then is, are the central banks going to be willing or be allowed to pursue the monetary policies that will get back to 2%? I'm inclined to think that they will be willing, that they really are determined from the conversations I've had with the top central bankers. But whether they will be allowed to do it is another question. If Donald Trump becomes the next president of the United States, who knows what he's going to do to the Federal Reserve? But it is a policy choice. It's not something dictated by forces out there. The rate of inflation is something that we can choose, and the central banks, I think, at the moment, do intend to get back to 2%.
All right, Martin, let's drill down then into the EBRD countries of operations. Beata, talk us through our next chart.
Well, so the good news is that the disinflation process in many of our countries of operations has proceeded very fast. Fast by historical standards, as you see in the chart that's being drawn before me, and also faster than we expected. Yet inflation remains above the pre-pandemic level, above the target in most countries. Martin talked about the choice the central bankers are making. Actually, monetary policy rates in many countries are at this point higher than they were at the peak inflation. Now, of course, not everywhere the disinflation process is done. If you look at cumulative inflation, that is inflation from February 2022 until last March, so almost 2 years, it exceeded 30% in several economies, notably Egypt, Kazakhstan, Turkey, Hungary, Moldova, and Ukraine. Now that means that in those countries, in the absence of wage increases, people would have lost about a third of the purchasing power of their incomes. So in other words, it's too early to be complacent. It's too early to think that the fight with inflation has been won, especially given the uncertainties, given the war in the Middle East, and the potential that if it spills over to other countries, it can affect oil prices.
Beata, thank you very much. And again, narrowing down to the SEMED region, Beata just mentioned Egypt as what is happening there, but how do you see it across your whole region in the southern and eastern Mediterranean, Heike?
No, absolutely. I think there is a trade-off in the southern eastern Mediterranean region between sort of further tightening of monetary policy to curb inflation, but also a lot of imported inflation and sort of stopping and stifling growth. So we actually have seen central banks, and I think it was interesting what Martin said sort of about the willingness. We have seen central banks in Egypt and in other countries hiking interest rate. Policy rates have increased fourfold in Egypt over the last 12 months. So there is a commitment to curb inflation, but given the large part of inflation is also depending on the exchange rate regime being imported through food inflation, this is really challenging and is also putting a bit of a brake on some of the new investments, because with interest rates at that level, you know, both companies and banks find it difficult to identify margins to foster growth and stimulate investment. So, but again, I don't want to sort of be too benign about it, but of course it's not a homogeneous picture. So Egypt and Lebanon and of course also now West Bank and Gaza suffer the most from high inflation. We see much lower inflationary picture for Morocco and Jordan. Of course, Jordan has the PAC, so it's also more linked to the US economy. But so it's not a similar picture across all of these regions. But high inflation is also something that companies and individuals have become used to, also having actually absorbed over the last 2 years already a lot of the adjustment. But you can really see, and if you live in, so I live in Cairo, if you live in these markets, that it is putting a pressure on a large part of the population, the level of persistent high inflation, the level of persistent high food inflation in particular, and energy inflation. So there will come a moment when further monetary tightening will be balancing off also with growth, but the inflation is a key determinant for policy rates at the moment.
And it's a political question as well,
it's
of
a
course,
very political
isn't it?
question,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yeah, especially in that region. Right, Harold James, what can history tell us about the way economies have dealt with inflation in the past and the path to recovery?
So there's an element of persistence, as Heike was just saying, about inflation, and particularly, I think, in the aftermath of really big negative supply shocks. I think there are many parallels here to the story of the 1970s, but central banks are behaving better than they did in the 1970s. But there are also parallels to previous supply shocks. And it's because I think there are all kinds of feedback loops that are put into the inflationary process. That is, you know, if you think of Egypt, for instance, Egypt is massively hit by the Russian attack on Ukraine and the basically stopping for some time of the grain trade across the Black Sea. So Russia, Ukraine were big suppliers of Egypt. But then you get after that a susceptibility to other supply shocks, and we find some that are just the result of chance, ships getting stuck in the Suez Canal, or the water level being too low in the Panama Canal, but also terrorism, the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. It goes on and on and on. And everybody who sits on some kind of supply choke point is going to use that. So that's one dynamic. And then if we're thinking about the industrial countries, there's an element of wage pressure that's now going on, and particularly, as Martin was saying, the economy in the United States is very, very hot. There are many, many labor shortages, but you find labor shortages even in the countries in Europe where growth is very low, because we're in the middle of a retransitioning phase. That also comes, I think, in the aftermath of supply shocks, that you need to move from one kind of labor force to another kind of labor force, and in that transition we find really big difficulties and big pressures.
It's quite interesting though, isn't it, Harold? Because I mean, economies are fascinating. You know, they always find a way to adjust in the end.
Yeah, but they're obviously
however painful it might be.
I mean, they're obviously having to spend more in order to adjust. So, you know, if we're thinking of making ourselves more secure or more resilient, we need more investment to do that. It's expensive. You're going to have to create new factories. They're not being created as quickly as they, you know, in semiconductors. They're working on something in Arizona, but it's taking longer. They're working on something in the middle of Germany, but it's taking much longer. And so that story is going to be of increased costs as well. So the cost pressure is also likely to remain there.
Interesting. Okay, let's move on then to something which is tangential, really, which is the question of borrowing costs, which we've started to touch on a little bit. Heike, you mentioned it. Beata, let's have a look then at what this means for how governments are coping with the economic environment and what's happening to the cost of borrowing. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. If you think about the borrowing cost in international markets, it consists of two parts. One is the global interest rate, the rate at which countries like Germany or the US are borrowing. And then there is a risk premium, the extra you pay because your economy is perceived as more risky than Germany. So what you see in this chart is the risk premium, so the spread between the cost of borrowing for our regions of operations and Germany. And we split in the report countries into two groups, the EU member states among our countries of operations and others. And what you see is that at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, there was an increase in spread in the risk premium that our regions are asked to pay. But then in the top part of the graph, this risk premium disappeared. So in other words, the non-EU countries of operations are paying the same risk premium they were paying in 2021. But look at the bottom part of this chart. The EU member states, they saw an increase in the borrowing cost over the German cost, but it still persists. So in 2021, they were paying 0.5% extra above what Germany was paying. Now they are paying a full percentage point extra. That's another place where the war is casting a long shadow on Europe.
Thank you, Beata. And Martin Wolf, in Italy, we see major geopolitical events casting the long shadow, affecting yield curves in global bond markets quite often. What do you think? How do you see this? And do you think high interest rates are going to be with us for the foreseeable future? As you said earlier, it depends really what central banks do, whether they take their responsibilities seriously as well.
Well, I think it's important to break out, I mean, we don't have time to go into detail, but what's happened to real interest rates, of which we have a direct measure because we have inflation index bonds issued by major states, and nominal rates, which include risk, which include inflation risk and above all, I won't go into term risk premium for the moment. So if we take the US, it's really a fascinating story. Real interest rates in the US troughed at -1% during the pandemic period. And they're now running at 2%, which is higher than they've been for a decade. So this is a 3 percentage point shift. And that's not inflation risk. And I don't think it's default risk. I think it's fundamental change in the economy, above all, the very strong demand that has been generated worldwide. And as long as that continues, I expect real interest rates to remain pretty high. Of course, if we go into a global recession, that will not be true. And it's a really big question here. But if you've got real interest rates rising by 3 percentage points, and it's a similar story for other countries like the UK, that's the sort of basis. And then, of course, you've got inflation risk. I'd like to point out that in the US, Beata gave interesting figures for cumulative inflation. Well, cumulative inflation since the pandemic in the US is 20%. Well, that means, I think, that people are going to be nervous about inflation for quite a long time in the US as well. And so inflation risk premium won't collapse. In other words, I think 10-year bond yields now around 4% plus could stay at that level for quite a long time unless there is a deep recession or a really immense inflation collapse. That is a more normal sort of rate historically, and we may be moving into a more normal period. So that means money is going to be more expensive. And the big question there, of course, is if that happens, are we going to get major debt crisis of some kind or some other big shock, which will actually tip us back into global recession, which would change this picture? The biggest conclusion, I think, is the future of interest rates in the core economies is really quite uncertain, but it looks to me plausible that we're not going to see the very low rates we had a few years ago, or even in the post-financial crisis period again.
With an impact on growth, I guess.
Well, it's a reflection of growth in part. As you pointed out, the world economy, and particularly the US, has been pretty strong. When the US economy is strong, if it remains strong, that tends to drive the world. And indeed, I think it was one of the main reasons, or a big reason, for the inflationary outcome of the post-pandemic period. The other big economy we haven't discussed at all is China. I'll put that to one side. But of course, how China performs will also have enormous impact on global demand.
All right, Martin, thank you very much indeed. Harold, just as you see things, what dangers, if you look at history, what dangers do you see given these geopolitical challenges, given the legacy of crises that we've had?
Well, in one way, it follows from what Martin was just saying, that if we think of this real interest rate story continuing, that has major fiscal consequences. And I think particularly it's evident in the debate that's already beginning in the United States about the fiscal implications of the rise in interest rates, because the amount of money that the United States government is going to have to pay to service the debt is going to increase and increase and increase. And that, I think, feeds into the story of the geopolitical tensions, because we're used, I think, to a world in which we thought of global stability as a global public good, global financial stability as a global public good. And when you have geopolitical tensions, it begins to look as if there's a different picture there, that it's in the interest of one country potentially to undermine stability, financial stability in other countries. I think many people saw this long interview, notorious interview of Tucker Carlson with President Putin. And there was an enormous amount on deep history, on 1,000 years since the baptism of St. Vladimir or St. Vladimir. But there was also a fascinating section in which President Putin discussed the United States debt and really emphasized very much the 33 trillion figure and said, this is the vulnerability of the United States, and what a financial run looks like, and whether it's also feasible when China is in a weak state that somebody will think that the Chinese economy is also vulnerable to financial pressure. This is a very, very new game. And as a historian, if I think about it, it reminds me a bit of the lead up to terrible events like 1914 or 1939, when the great powers were doing exactly that. Instead of trying to get global stability, they were trying to undermine each other.
Yeah. Yeah, and we haven't talked about it, but of course the slow death of globalization does play into all of that, and we'll come back to that in just a few minutes. By the way, if you want to ask us a question and ask the panel a question, slido.com, go there and you will find our session, put your question in there. Find the hashtag, and we'll be delighted to ask those questions a bit later on. We've got quite a few coming in already. Let's move on, though. It's been 20 years, Beata, since 8 EBRD countries joined the EU, namely Czechia, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, the Slovak Republic, and Slovenia. Can we see the difference in their economic performance? Is that coming through? Do we see the economic benefits of this? I guess the answer is yes, for those of us who travel to those countries regularly. We see it, actually, physically.
Absolutely. So, during the 20 years of EU membership, our 8 countries have made huge progress. On the eve of the membership, in 2003, their GDP per capita on average was a quarter of that of Germany. Now it's about a half. Now, in our regional economic prospects, which we launched today, we asked the question, how much of that improvement in the living standards can be attributed to the EU factor? And this is what you see in this graph. The top line shows you the trajectory of the 8 EU member states, while the bottom line shows you how these countries would have done had they not joined the EU. It's a counterfactual, it's built based on control on other economies, on performance of comparable states. And what you see is that about a half of the progress they made can be attributed to the EU factor. But it's not just income, it's also life satisfaction, it's also health. If you look at self-reported health status, people in the EU8 are feeling as healthy as people in G7 countries. This is true of both men and women up to the age of 70.
Thank you very much, Beata. I mean, there's some amazing gains there. Clearly the fruits of economic integration in Europe, a bit of globalization impact in all of that. But Harold, is that fast growth due to globalization and integration coming to an end? Because we're definitely seeing, as we've touched on a few times over the last 30 or 40 minutes, that fracturing of the globalization gains.
Well, the signals are very, very mixed, and I think it's a bit like the weather here in Armenia. So on the one hand, there's the fracturing, the geopolitical tensions, countries trying to work against each other. The announcement, as Beata said yesterday, of this just amazing new tariff regime in the United States with the quadrupling of the tariffs on electrical vehicles and many other tariffs that are going to impact China, obviously, directly, but also impact Europe as a supplier of things to China. So that's a very, very bad story. On the other hand, we're in a period of absolutely amazingly fast technical change. And that, I think, is what's underpinning the growth, and it's what's driving growth, but not just in the United States, in other countries as well. So the application of AI, and it will be to all kinds of things. It's not just a limited area, but it's in medical applications, it's in education, it's in farming. So there are lots of things in which AI is really going to raise productivity very, very dramatically, and this is a big driver. And it's also going to drive connectedness, because the AI applications are going to be available across frontiers. And we're actually seeing also trade still increasing despite these processes of fragmentation. So the question is, it's really two horses pulling in different directions. On the one hand, there's a kind of political force that's pulling against globalization, and on the other hand, there's a technical force that is pushing globalization very, very quickly. And my bet, really also based on thinking about past experiences of this, is that the technical horse and that the progress is going to win on this. And the governments that don't adjust to this are going to look incompetent and bad, and they will be attacked by their voters, or even if they're autocracies, by disaffection. And so countries that don't adjust to this are going to lose out, and the technical horse will win.
Yeah, never underestimate the march of technology. Martin Wolf in Italy, where do you see globalization going and free trade? You know, we have had President Biden's announcement in the past 24 hours. I'm sure there'll be some retaliation probably, I guess, and other countries will also have to think about where they want to go on this. Where does everything indicate that we're going on this?
Well, first of all, let me build on what Harold has said, because I think it's very important points. I see globalization as having multiple facets. So there's the movement of goods, there's the movement of services, including internet-enabled services, there's the movement of capital, there's the movement of people, and there's the movement of ideas. They are linked, but they also have distinct characteristics. I would say that the area that is now most pressured is the movement of goods, particularly manufacturers, which is the dominant part of it, among the major countries. And this links actually, interestingly, with the movement of capital. And that was the theme of my last but one book, which was on the financial crisis. It's called The Shifts and the Shocks. Basically, I think that we have a core problem, which is now leading to this reaction, is that China has developed very rapidly, but it has also developed with an extraordinarily unbalanced economy with unbelievably high savings, which they have pretty consistently been unable to absorb fully domestically, efficiently. And I just focus on this. I won't go into all the other things because it's core. Up to the financial crisis, this showed itself in a current account surplus of 10% of GDP. After that, they absorbed it in the biggest real estate bubble in the history of the world, which is now ending, and they have to decide how to use their excess savings now. And we in the West, Europe, America, are terrified that they're going to use it to recreate the colossal trade surplus in high-tech manufacturing, which will basically wipe out our high-tech manufacturing sector. And I was in China in February. I had did a number of lectures, and I said, if that's what you're going to do, and it's pretty clear that's what they want to do, it won't happen. So I'm going to say strongly that this Chinese trade exports surge to solve the domestic imbalance problem and dominate these sectors will not be allowed to happen, and trade in goods related to that will be massively impaired. In other areas like virtual trade, internet, movement of information, ideas, possibly even people, there's going to go on being lots and lots of globalization. And in a lot of that, as Harold says, technology will play a part. But we are now seeing, I think, the beginning of a complete breakdown between Europe and America on the one hand, and China. It's not going to be allowed to happen. And I think we're at an early stage of what is going to be seen in retrospect as a massive protectionist war.
Yeah, that's very concerning. Thank you very much indeed, Martin. And actually, in terms of tensions, and that's what we're really talking about here and how they play into economics, let me just ask before we come to some audience questions that have been sent in. We talked about the end of the peace dividend. We've talked about, what is happening with tensions. We're seeing predicted rises in defense spending in many economies. We're back to the guns and butter argument, that well-known, issue. I wonder, Beata, how you see that and what the impact is going to be on our economies as a result of the geopolitical tensions and rising defense spending that many countries are having to undertake. Yeah.
Well, there are many aspects to that question, but let me focus on a new term that has recently been coined: connector countries. Countries that pursue multi-vector policies and serve as a conduit of trade, as transit routes. And actually, this region has the potential. So this region, meaning Caucasus countries, Central Asian countries, have the potential to benefit through tensions by becoming a transit corridor between China and the West. That is not trivial to achieve because you need some investment, and because we are talking about multimodal transport by land and by sea, and because you need to cross borders multiple times as you ship goods. But this is a scope for, there's scope for cooperation and actually benefiting from what's happening in the world.
And Heike, just before we let you go, in your region we see those rises in tensions. Do you think there's going to be a question of how governments spend their budgets in the region as a result of all this?
No, absolutely. I think the peace dividend and actually also the global public good that Harold was speaking about earlier on financial stability is really hitting the southern Eastern Mediterranean doubly, both from the impact of the war on Ukraine, but also from the war in Gaza. So I think this is actually slowing down integration. And actually, speaking of connector countries, because Egypt, of course, also perceives itself as a connector country between Europe and Africa and through the Suez Canal on trade route. But here, the interplay between the peace dividend and being such a connector country really play out because of the disruption of trade through the Suez Canal, really limiting the ability for Egypt to become this connector country. But maybe to also end on a positive note, because I have to also go now to the Egypt country panel, which I want to sort of also have a segue on a positive note. I think these connector countries in North Africa, from a technological point of view, this is maybe an area where there's less trade-offs with the peace dividend, and for example, data centers looking at internet connectivity, green data center, given the abundance of renewable energy. This is something that a number of emerging markets, in particular in North Africa, can benefit from and can actually adapt to the challenges that are coming disruptively through the geopolitical tension. So I think I also bet on the technology horse. So looking at how the connection via more internet-related, AI-related, and the demands following for data centers and connectivity on that area, I think more countries also that are not even geostrategically linked between China and emerging markets could benefit.
We always hope technology will be the cavalry riding to the rescue in every crisis. Heike, thank you very much indeed. We'll let you go, and good luck with your next panel. Harold James, let me turn to you. You see things through the vision of history. What does that tell us about how we should be viewing the defence spending argument in terms of economies?
So it's clear in this environment where there are more and more security threats that countries are going to spend more on defence. And it's a big debate in Europe. President Macron gave it an additional impetus last week. But you already see, I think, the effects that Poland is spending over 4% of its GDP on defence. Germany is going to be pushed to go over 2%. But when you think about this, it seems to me that this is also not something that we should consider in terms of your guns or butter dichotomy, but that actually a lot of defence spending now is really also very, very high tech.
Comes to technology again.
Exactly. So, I mean, it's not just a question of putting antiquated tanks onto the road, or it's not a question of putting the belts and the boots and so on that armies used to really depend on, but it's a question of developing really high-tech defense shields in the first place. And, you know, I think you saw a few weeks ago, after the Iranian attack on Israel, actually the importance of the technical shields and this amazing success in terms of stymieing the attack, I think is something that countries will want to emulate. But in order to do that, they will really have to go on the high-tech side of defence spending.
And it's interesting, we wouldn't have had the internet, of course, without defence spending. Yeah. We tend to forget these things. Martin Wolf, do you see this question of defence spending as important in playing into the future trajectory, or is it marginal, incremental? How do you view this?
Well, I think it's definitely non-marginal. As has already been noted, we have come out of the financial crisis and even more the pandemic with enormously high public debt levels in a lot of countries. dramatically, including some of the world's biggest, notably the US, which is also running huge fiscal deficits already. We have very powerful pressures from our aging societies for additional spending on pensions, health, crucially, old age care. We have weak growth, partly because of demographics. Labor forces are in many countries not growing, even shrinking. Now, if you add to that already shows lots of fiscal pressure, and interest rates, as has been noted, are higher than they were before. So the cost of servicing debt is already high. If you add to that a couple of percentage points, maybe in the end, but certainly one or more of spending on defense, this builds up to a very, very powerful fiscal pressure. And there's absolutely no desire in slow-growing economies and very little willingness to raise taxes. Well, if you add these together, it tells me that we're going to have pretty big fiscal debt problems. And by the way, in addition, we have an awful lot of private debt, which is going to be refinanced at higher interest rates, and not subject we haven't even discussed. I am focusing predominantly on the high-income Western countries. So I think if you add this together, I'm not talking about other countries, but I think similar issues will arise. I think we can foresee pretty safely a lot of fiscal debt problems coming up over the next decade or so. And when debt problems loom, they tend to become imminent. So they might start showing themselves in debt markets quite soon.
Well, that's very interesting, Martin, and it leads us neatly on to our audience questions, which we're going to move to now, because we've had a question which also focuses on fiscal pressures in some ways. Someone has written into us and says, many expenditures are expected, including those for climate initiatives. Obviously, more pressure on governments to spend there. Do you think central banks might be forced, is the question, to increase the inflation target as a result of all of this? Martin?
Well, I don't think it helps. The problem is, in my view, if they increase the inflation target to deal with the pressures now, that will erode the real value of outstanding debt, which gives you a little bit of a breather. It will raise interest rates permanently, and it will raise inflation risk premium permanently, which, by the way, are a real cost. And because people will say, well, if they do it now because it's difficult, well, the next time it's difficult, they're going to do it again. And where are we going to end up? So I don't think it's really going to help. If one's going to be really brutal about it, one would say, well, the thing for them to do is engineer another colossal jump in prices, which does erode the real value of outstanding debt. But if you start getting a reputation for doing things like that, and as I pointed out, we've just done it. Prices in the US and UK have jumped 20% in the last 3 years, which is 10 years inflation in 3 years. If you get a reputation for doing that, you end up being Argentina. So I think raising the inflation target is a non-solution.
Yes, and big political questions as well if you do that. Martin, thank you very much indeed. Slido.com, by the way, is where you can send your questions in. You can see it there on the screen. There's a QR code. It's hashtag 668-37795, Slido.com. And there is a question actually from Shevki. How can, maybe this is one for you, Beata, how can you bring inflation under control in Turkey with policy measures only when pricing behaviour has lost all connection to reality and reason? So what are we seeing on inflation, do you think, in Turkey?
Well, what's positive is the fact that Turkey has realized that even though disinflation is costly, the cost of keeping inflation keeping inflation high for the foreseeable future is going to be even more costly, right? For the society as well as politically. And I think we are seeing now action that is aimed at disinflation. Now, how far the central bank will go, and how fast it will be able to bring inflation under control remains to be seen. But I think what's very important is this change of mindset.
Okay, and another question which has come in from Martin. How does the Russian economy stand compared to the US and EU? Are economic sanctions effective? Harold, maybe I'll ask you this. You know, I mean, you talked about Putin's very long interview with Tucker Carlson. We've seen what's going on in terms of various reorganizations in the Russian government to focus on, in effect, a war economy. But I wonder how you see this question. Again, you know, history tells us economic sanctions, you know, they're quite tough to make effective, actually. Really effective. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the long history of economic sanctions is, on the whole, a story of failure. But I think in this particular case, the sanctions have had a dramatic impact on Russia, and what we've seen in the last week or so with the restructuring of the Russian government is indeed an absolute sign of the Russian government thinking about
have to focus on effectiveness now to make the most of their resources.
Absolutely. Yeah. But in a sense, this is something where you know, a different kind of perspective in terms of the time horizon is there in the case of a conflict, because if you're involved in a conflict, it's worth spending an enormous amount if you think that you can solve it or you can resolve it in your favor quickly. And what I believe is that there's a vision in Russia, which is that this conflict can't be conducted over a long period of time. But if it's conducted through this year, and if as a result of that conflict, the Russians manage to influence the outcome of the election in the United States, or they manage to push the EU into the disintegration that President Macron was fearing, then they've won in a sense. And so you know, they're taking a strategic gamble on wrecking their economy over a long-term perspective in order to wreck our economy and the economy of the United States in the shorter-term perspective. So it's a gamble, and we have to hope that it doesn't succeed.
That is an interesting point, isn't it, Martin, as to whether Russia is in a better position because it can take a longer-term view than our democracies, where inevitably we're taking, you know, 4 or 5 year view.
Well, my own view, but of course this is that if you look at it from the priorities of the Russian people, it's a disaster. But from the point of view of Mr. Putin, it is not. And he is the unchecked ruler of this place. I don't regard that as indicating much about the longer-term future of Russia, which is clearly and unambiguously being impoverished in the long term. We can go into that in detail. But, I mean, as far as the war is concerned, Harold is clearly right. The outcome will be decided by politics, predominantly politics in the West. And we are seeing very worrying signs of lack of willingness to supply Ukraine with the resources we can easily afford. These are trivial sums for the West. And if we lack the will to sustain our values domestically and externally, then our systems are going to become dramatically weakened and possibly even collapse. And this is something I've recently written a book about, and it worries me a great deal. But it's not necessary, and in my view, it's completely insane.
Okay. And Beata, a question from Sarah. What can governments do to address shrinking, aging populations to foster long-term growth in the midst of a questionable geopolitical and climate backdrop? I guess that's about the complexity of the task facing governments. But the question of population is one for quite a few EBRD countries of operations.
Well, let me mention one thing that's, I think, very important. The technological change that's very rapid means that it becomes harder for older workers to stay employed. And, you know, if you look at statistics in our countries of operations, people have lower ICT skills than people in advanced economies, and there's particular drop-off in those skills at the age of 50 plus. So I think the single fairly straightforward thing to do is to train workers, particularly older workers, so they can continue working for longer. Also, if you look at, you know, where people get ICT training, when surveys show that people in our countries of operations are equally likely to take free training as people in advanced economies, but they are less likely to be trained by their employers. And I think that's linked to the fact that many employers don't want to invest in workers because they are worried that once they acquire skills, they will want more money or they will go somewhere else. And I think this mindset needs to change, and perhaps we need to offer subsidized training to old workers.
And Martin, shrinking and aging populations, it's definitely one of the big economic questions of our time, isn't it?
Yes, I wrote a column that appeared on Monday on the aging part of this, but obviously there are two parts of it. There is aging, which I think Beata discussed an important part of the solution. And I'm really not going to repine over the fact that everybody, that everyone over 60 isn't dead, which is what pretty well it used to be, because even the young would like to not to die tomorrow. And the transformation in that regard is simply staggering. I think it's an unbelievable figure that in 1965, the most common age of death in the UK was below 1, and now it's 87. Is that a bad thing? Surely not. But there are challenges associated with this. One is obviously, I'm not going to go into the very sensitive issue of fertility rates, and the other is the even more sensitive issues of immigration. I do think we're going to have to think about creating a world in which it is easier for young people to have children. I think we can do something in that regard, and we're going to have to be reasonably open to immigration. And to my immense surprise, in my own country, despite the Brexit absurdity, we're actually accepting an enormous number of immigrants, and they seem, by and large, to be fitting very well into our country. But those are big issues, big questions, and I know there are societies which absolutely refuse to have immigrants, and they have very, very low fertility rates, below 1, and they are going to have some very, very big problems. And one of them, interestingly, is China.
Mm. Thank you, Martin. Yes, I have to say, speaking as somebody in my 7th decade of life, I can attest to the fact that everybody over 60 is not dead, as can quite a few of us on this panel. Right, thank you very much indeed to our panel. Thank you to Beata, of course, to Harold James, to Martin in Italy, to Heike, who was here earlier. What a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for being with us. Our latest economic forecasts, the REP, the Regional Economic Prospects, are available on our website, ebrd.com. Have a look at them there. They make for very interesting reading. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can subscribe to our podcast, of course, the EBRD podcast. We discuss all this and more. But thank you, and thank you to our audience as well. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you.